Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. And I'm so excited and honored to be introducing Dr. Mayer to you. Dr. Mayer is one of the world's leading experts on the microbiome, and he literally wrote the book on the microbiome and how it influences us. He has published over 300 peer-reviewed scientific papers. I mean, I don't know how you have managed to publish that many papers, but Dr. Mayer is just this brilliant physician, researcher, expert. He has written over 100 different content in various textbooks and helped develop that. He is the director of, let me make sure if we've got this correct here, director of, you know what, I'm going to restart this, sorry. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm so honored to be introducing Dr. Mayer to you. Dr. Mayer is the world's leading expert on the microbiome and how that influences us in our experience of everyday life. He literally wrote the book on the topic, and I highly recommend for all of you to read this because it is so informative and it is so important for you to understand what he is talking about. This gentleman is the professor in 3 different departments at the UCLA School of Medicine. He has published over 300 peer-reviewed scientific journals. He is the co-director of the Center for Ulcer Research and Education. He's also the director of the Oppenheimer Center for Neurobiology of Stress. And I mean, I don't know if there is a better expert for us to be talking to about how the microbiome and the bacteria within our body ultimately influence us and just this entire interaction that takes place. And thank you for being here, Dr. Mayer. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, thanks for inviting me to be, part of this interview based on the conversation that we had before of what your interest is and what your goal is with these interviews. I'm delighted to be part of this.
Well, thank you. You know, part of why I reached out to you is when I was reading your book, I had this multiple like holy cow moments where it was just like, oh my God, like how does he see things in this way? And a part of why I wanted to reach out to you is, in our community, in our world, my world of children who have severe behavioral issues and unexplainable anxiety and all of these other neuropsychiatric manifestations, honestly, I think there's an oversimplification to how the microbiome and the gut bacteria ultimately influence us. And that's really what I would love, for you to share about, because we are starting to understand, and I think in my world, people are starting to see how the gut influences us and how the bacteria influence us. But this discussion that you bring forward, where it's truly a bidirectional connection, and you kind of equate it to the 405, the super highway with tons of traffic going one way and another. I think that conversation is something that's really been missed. So I would love for us to talk about this and for you to share with our audience, just all of this wisdom that you've developed over, decades, and how you see the microbiome and how you see it ultimately influencing health, especially for these children.
So we could have a very long conversation about this. I mean, I've had an interest in body-brain interactions for a long time, a career-long interest, and it's actually the reason I went into medicine. Decided to go into medical school because this was the one area that fascinated me the most, and that was a long time ago, before many of the breakthroughs that we have now witnessed in the last the last decade or so have happened. Over time, I was fascinated, for a long time I was fascinated by just the way the gut and the brain interacts and the role the gut, plays in emotional regulation, and as you say, in the bidirectional communication, how emotions in the brain and stress influences gut function, and how events in the gut, including food intake and infections, how that feeds back to the brain, and how this, the only way to explain this really is in a systems, so-called systems biological viewpoint, that these are not linear systems. These are just like any other complex systems with multiple connections and bidirectional communications, feedback loops. So the simplistic explanations that have been brought forward in, textbook medicine for a long time are really not adequate to explain this. Some things are easy. I've learned a lot from my patients because if you just listen to your patients, you will see how close this connection is. And this information has long been dismissed by physicians who said, this is all imagined, this is not science, this is neurotic behavior. But if you really listen to it and then are involved with stand with one foot in the science, you will realize, wow, this actually makes a lot of sense. And so about 10 years ago, I thought I had figured it all out in terms of brain-gut communications. And then came the microbiome. And obviously that seemed to be like the last missing piece of the puzzle, because the microbiome fit into the concepts that we had until then perfectly as the missing link that links, diet, I would say primarily diet, and then early life events into this, into this system. So today, I would say the book was a result of decades of science, of listening to patients, and of many experiences that I've had as a physician at an academic institution, both negative and positive in this area.
Can you help our audience understand a little bit more about the microbiome? Because in your book, you talk about how the microbiome is this collection of microbes that outnumbers us. They have way more genetic material than we do. They're producing, if I remember correctly in your book, you say that 40% of the metabolites and compounds within our bloodstream actually comes from the gut bacteria. They produce more hormones than we ever will. So can you help our audience understand just the significance of this? And how these tiny little organisms, which are ultimately the weight and I guess size of our liver, if you were to compress them together, how that ultimately influences our physiology and literally our experience of life?
Yeah, I mean, the answer that I can give today is very incomplete. I've become really humble of what we understand of this system. Given the complexity that's evolving, the deeper you look into it, it's like looking into the night sky, and you're overwhelmed by the depth and the complexity and the vastness. It's sort of a similar kind of experience. On the other hand, so one thing, a good reminder of the intelligence and power of microorganisms is the current COVID-19, epidemic or pandemic that we're witnessing. I mean, a tiny invisible organism basically can bring the whole world to a standstill and cause revolutions. And we still don't know what the end result is of that. And if you look back in history, I mean, this has happened before. So microorganisms are incredibly powerful and smart entities that have a lot of knowledge from, I put this in my book as well, of where to attack, how to attack, which are the most vulnerable people to attack. It's kind of amazing when you think about that, that's something that we don't see, has this kind of a knowledge that we as scientists don't really have. But coming back to, I mean, our microbes, even though they're also as small as pathogens or viruses, they play a totally different game. I mean, they're not after killing us or using us as a reproductive, platform. They really live in symbiosis with us and have for millions of years. They have during that time, even before they made this contract with us that it's better to live together than separately. They have been able to come up with genes for compounds that only a small fraction we know today. So they can produce these, have these millions of genes compared to our 20,000, our mere 20,000 human genes. And this, excuse me, and they have actually, they've been pretty generous in exchanging some of these genes, exchanging some of this information with us. So many of the genes that we have, there's a phenomenon called lateral gene transfer, that microbial organisms can transfer these genes to us. And so many of our neurotransmitters in our enteric nervous system, but also in our brain, have homologs, have molecules very similar to the ones that the microbes use. And so forming a, I would say, completely integrated communication system that uses the same words, the same language, the grammar is pretty different, to talk to us, and we talk back to them, because many of our neurotransmitters, like just take serotonin, that the microbes themselves don't produce, but they can stimulate our gut cells to produce serotonin, and then this serotonin talks back to the microbes. The microbes take it up and use it. So there's, even at that level, is this bidirectional communication. So this is still unfolding. I mean, our knowledge of these complexities is unfolding, and none of them are linear. So it's not like our typical science where we put, we have a few human cells and or microbial cells, and they put a drop of serotonin onto them and control everything else, that you would be able to say, what's the output of this? A linear system would allow you to do this, but this is not the case. It's so many feedback loops come into play that, so I would say, I'm at this stage, and as a matter of fact, I'm just submitted my second book to the publisher, to HarperCollins. So by next spring, hopefully that will become available. And I've taken an even deeper dive into this area. So there's no question, this is a very important regulatory system that interacts with us very closely. I wouldn't say it's another organ. It's more complex than an organ, really, because it also connects to the outside world, to the microbes in the outside world, and it connects with the substances that are in our plants that feed some of these microbes. So it's more complex than having another liver, really. But ultimately, what role this plays in diseases like neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and relevant for your patient population, autism spectrum disorder, we've made progress, but we can't say 100% yet what this role is. Is it causative? Is it an association? Is it, what's the chicken and the egg? But despite this caveat, I would say there's two areas that I would say they play the most important role. One is early in life, in the developmental period, where our own brain systems are being established and programmed, and the microbiome is being programmed the first 3 years of life, and later in life, where the metabolites and the compounds that microbes produce from the food that we eat and the medications that we take in, if that goes on over 20, 30, 40 years and has a low impact but chronic effect on our brain cells, I think the evidence is growing that this plays a significant role in these various diseases of neurodegeneration. So early in life and late in life, I personally think that's these are the most important targets for understanding it. What happens in the middle, I'm a skeptic. I have to say, I don't believe that microbes cause depression or cause anxiety that if you, you know, if you eat the wrong thing, you get anxious from this food, and that's because the microbes produce something. I think the evidence for that is good in mouse models, but in humans, the evidence is still a long ways to go, you know. But
I love
maybe,
the fact that you're pointing out just how complex that this relationship is, and I mean, there's no better person in the world to know this than you. And I love how you talk about in your book that we're superorganisms, that they are part of us. The microbes, the bacteria, all the organisms in our gut are basically a part of us, and we are a part of them, and we're truly almost one organism functioning together. And I think one of the things that I loved about your book is you really almost separate or lose that separation between them and us, because in a way there isn't separation, right? We're so closely connected, and how much they can influence us, from the nutrients we can absorb to even some changes in our various states of hormones and other the inflammatory response. And you know, one of the things that I loved about how you kind of bring this forward in your book, and I think that this is part of what you're really trying to highlight to our audience, this complexity that we don't truly understand, is how we can influence them. And it's almost like if we're sitting in a cafe and you're with your, you know, family or your friends, and you're chatting with them, they're chatting with you, you tend to be really irritated, you can make them irritated. So it's truly a exchange that's happening. It isn't just they influence us, or just because we took an antibiotic that destroys them. It's way more complicated than this. It's truly this dance that we do with them. Is that a good way to really look at it?
yeah, and that's a very good way. So, you know, the mistake that has happened is still ongoing, really, in science, that we look at them um, in the same way as we look at pathogens. You know, we look at, here's the bad guy, and this bad guy invades our gut, and then it causes very specific changes. We know all of this. You know, we know a lot about how pathogens work, all the way down to the molecular mechanisms. But that's very different from a system that has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, where the basic you know, the basic rule was symbiosis. You know, we want to work together. We have no interest. None of us has an interest to destroying each other, because we know it's not good for us. Even though we have done a lot of this destroying, we have done a lot with the antibiotics and, you know, the chemicals that we put into our food production. But in reality, that's what makes it so difficult, because once you have a complex system like this, it's not just if the relative abundance of one microbial species goes up, that will have a specific effect. It's just not going to work like this. It will, that increase in abundance of one organism will influence all the other thousands of other organisms, and the end result of that interaction, then that's what influences us, you know. And that we don't really know, because many of these organisms, we don't even know who are involved in this dance or in this conversation. And I mean, just to sort of expand this further, you know, in my new book, I've sort of expanded on this connection between, so a big part of what influences our microbes in the adult life is diet. There's no question that right now, I would say, is, you know, is on top of the list. And then we look at where the diet comes from. So let's say, look at plant-based diet. Plants grow in the soil. The soil has its own microbiome. The relationship of the soil microbiome with the root system of plants is actually very homologous to the interaction of our gut microbiome with our gut. It's fascinating. And so what we do to the soil, you know, with the chemical fertilizers and the pesticides and all the things we do, that influences the composition of all the components of the plant. Then when we eat this plant, this altered plant, it may look the same, but it has totally different nutrient contents. That affects our gut microbes again. And this change then affects our gut and our brain and our health. So even this communication goes beyond our brain and our gut microbes. It involves, you know, the soil microbes, and it involves what this very close communication that soil microbes have with plants. And believe it or not, even some of the same neurotransmitters are being used in this communication between the soil and the plant. So it's really, it's a
That's
real
amazing.
holistic story, you know. And you know, so we haven't talked about, so what progress have you made in areas that are relevant, you know, to your patients directly? So so you could say, well, given this complexity, it's hopeless. You know, we're going to need another 20 years before we even can begin to, you know, develop diagnostics or therapeutics based on that. But I think, you know, we've learned we've learned a lot, and as I said, in terms of the areas where we, I think, have learned the most is really the early development. And this early development between the evolving gut microbes and the evolving brain circuitry. Even the microbes in a pregnant mother, how they interact with their metabolites with the fetus and the developing child. So those, I think those could be very relevant and practical and actionable insights even today, you know, for
how it affects. One of the things that you pointed out that I think I need to highlight for our audience is just this really complex relationship and interactions. And, you know, I'll put it in context in terms of, you know, one of the concerns I had. So this is probably about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, when I was doing these stool studies on these kids. What I would notice over and over and over again was that the children who were on the spectrum, the kids with anxiety disorder, they all had a similar profile. They all had distortions in Clostridium. They all had overgrowth of yeast like Candida. And a lot of these kids didn't have a lot of antibiotic exposure. And then what was weird to me is then I would get kids that had, you know, 30 courses of antibiotics because of recurrent ear infections. And those are the kids that I for sure thought would have all kinds of strange things growing that we could detect. And all of a sudden, those kids actually had relatively normal looking, you know, microflora. And that was, you know, when I had my aha moment, like this can't be the way that we've described it, in the sense that, you know, just because something is there, we have to go after it. And in my world, one of the things I see happening oftentimes is, you know, practitioners will do a stool test or whatever test and say, oh, your kid has too much Clostridium. I'm going to use X antibiotic or X herb to kill that Clostridium because it's bad, it's causing these issues, and I will fix your kid. And one of the things, and part of the whole purpose behind Holistic Minds, is to say, well, yes, that's important, but you have to look at the child holistically. And I think that's one of the things you talked about, that you can't just take this one thing out of context, because there's probably a reason why that overgrowth happened. And in your book, you talk about how norepinephrine and these catecholamines and these chemicals that we produce actually can change the bacteria. They can cause the good bacteria to drop and these bad actors to actually increase. And you even say in there that they become even more aggressive. So can you help us understand why it's not wise to just do this kind of shotgun tunnel visioned approach, and why it's important to look at the child as a whole, and how these connections, these beautiful connections, these complex connections that you live in, this world that you live in, like how all of that can play a part in these weird organisms growing that may not be so helpful?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say you're pointing out something that, you know, there's companies now that do stool testing, growing number of companies. Some do it in a more sophisticated way, look at the function, like using metagenomics. Most of them are still using just these relative abundance measurements, the sequencing, and then they make predictions out of this. You get a list of things. You know, this is high, so for this you have to do this, and you have to take an antibiotic and a probiotic and a prebiotic. this is just not going to work at this point. You know, it's as we said earlier, it's the functional output of a large community of microorganisms that ultimately determines what communicates with us, the host. So if you have a high level of you know, Clostridia or Prevotella, that by itself does not really tell you, you know, if it's good or bad, or that you have to use an antibiotic or particular antibiotic, non-absorbable, like, you know, rifaximin, which has sort of gotten a big boost with this whole microbiome science. It's so one easy way to kind of explain it, and we're slowly getting there. So the actual players, so who is there in your stool sample is probably not that important. If you, it's what they produce, and the production depends in part on the interactions they have with other. So like all these microbes influence each other. So some produce antimicrobial substances to suppress the competitor. Others live in symbiosis with each other. So so you have to look at the whole community, their functional output. That's ultimately, I think, what determines how this interacts with our gut and with our brain. And we're not really there yet. You know, it's very difficult, even from the results of the most advanced tests. You need artificial intelligence, you need very complex, you need very large numbers of samples, tens of thousands of stool samples to be able to use artificial intelligence, as you know, to come up with the right computations. So what these shared abnormalities that you observed, you know, when you did these early stool tests, what they mean, are they, the question always comes up of causality, what's the chicken and the egg? Are they just a reflection of what goes on in the brain, and the brain sends these tonic signals to the gut? And, you know, we also have to remember the habitat that these microbes live on is influenced by, you know, by our gut cells that we have genetically, then it's influenced by our diet, or you know, the breast milk from the mother that obviously has a lot of components in it that influences the microbes, and then it's influenced by what the brain sends down, and how many of these neurotransmitters are then released into the gut lumen. So I mentioned serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. They all have been shown to be not just released into our body, but when you're stressed, the same amount of norepinephrine gets into your gut. And for a long time, we didn't know what the function of that is. And so today, you know, it changes the functional and behavior of a large number of microbes. So what you see in your stool sample is the integral between the diet, or, you know, or the diet of the mother, the brain's influence, and the genetic factors that you know, because many things could be genetic as well. If you're on the you know, on the spectrum, I mean, I'm not a pediatrician, but I ask all of my patients, you know, the first thing is always in terms of the family history, and I'm not interested, even though I'm a gastroenterologist, I'm not interested in their GI history. I'm interested in anything that is on the spectrum. So anxiety, autism spectrum disorders, attention deficit. And I would say that, you know, close to 100% of patients, I get a positive history that there's somewhere on the spectrum. This patient I see is somewhere on the spectrum. Maybe a totally different symptoms, symptomatic expression, but that also tells you that genetics play a role in you know, how they influence this habitat of the microbes.
So in a way, we create the soil, if you want to say. I'm sure this is a gross oversimplification, but we create the soil in which these plants, these bacteria, then grow in. And depending on how nutrient rich or nutrient poor the soil is, we can actually alter which bacteria can grow and thrive and which don't. And then they turn around and then influence us because of the compounds that they secrete. So it's truly this dance, this going back and forth, and it's constant. As you said, it's dynamic.
It's dynamic, and it's just like any other system. It's not stable. You know,
Mm.
it shows oscillations. So we know there's diurnal oscillations. It's very different when you sleep and are fasting, and you know, don't have food coming down the GI tract. And it's the studies now. It's seasonal. So in countries where there's a seasonal variation in the diet, this microbial body host interaction is cycles with the seasons. And you know, fasting is another. So it's become quite popular in adult obesity treatment. These various techniques of intermittent fasting or of time restricted eating, which have major effects on not just what the microbes produce, but also how they interact with us. So when we're eating, they're closer to the surface of the gut, of the lining of the gut, and have close interactions with immune cells. And when we're fasting, this you know, this separation increases. So it's a system with feedback loops, but also, like any system, it oscillates at different frequencies. And
Huh.
it's another area that we just beginning to understand. I mean, we don't really know, you know, the cycling of any physiological functions. We're not really know too much about this, what this does for health. I would say a healthy organism, including a healthy brain-gut axis, shows normal oscillations. And if these oscillations disappear based on an unhealthy diet or chronic stress, that's an indication that the system is weakened. You know, is not functioning. And I'm sure this plays a big role in these various psychiatric diseases or spectrum disorders. That if you did very careful assessments of time courses, of physiological functions, or metabolites that are being produced, you would see, you could, you know, chronobiology, so the term for that, you could possibly even diagnose at some point what disturbance this individual is going through.
Wow. Well, I know we're about to, or we're running out of time. So I want to ask you one quick question, and you may laugh at this. Do you think when will we be at a time where we could truly understand how the gut bacteria are influencing us, and can we ever get to a point of sophistication where through stool testing or, you know, metabolite testing, we can say, okay, this is what's going on, and let's go in there and, as you said, kind of hack or reprogram the gut bacteria to ultimately bring a state of health? Like, are we 10 years away, 20 years away? We don't even know because it's so complex.
Yeah, and so in science, it's always hard to make these predictions. You know, it could, I mean, certainly with constantly increasing sophistication of technologies, and you know, I mean, the growth of computing capacity has clearly been the major driving force behind microbiome science. We would not be able to say anything today if we didn't have supercomputers, you know, who were able to crack some of the code, and this will continue. I mean, clearly we will, you know, see rapid progress. Kind of hard to predict how fast it's going to go. Artificial intelligence is one of the most rapidly growing technologies, you know. So I think the direction it's going, these functional assessments like metatranscriptomics, we look at what genes, what transcripts they express, or metagenomics,
Wow.
what genes are being activated, or metabolomics, where we actually measure the proteins or that are being produced. These technologies create an amazing amount of data. I mean, it's so I think the limitation today is how do we make sense of all this data? We can measure all of this,
Huh.
but I think the minute we can measure it and have this data on thousands or tens of thousands of patients, and those efforts are happening. There are consortia now, international consortia, who are doing that in Alzheimer's disease. So we're part of a consortium. US European consortium, which is looking at thousands of patients with these techniques. So I think there could be a sudden breakthrough. I think you could have something, a fingerprint that allows you to say this person's risk for Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease is tenfold increased. And with the intervention, I think we're still lagging behind. I think the stage right now is that we're beginning to understand how diet components, certain molecules that are in our diet, from the simple fiber content to these polyphenol contents and anti-inflammatory molecules, how we can use diet to manipulate this complex system. That also has led to a new science, a new dietary science, nutrition science, that for the first time we really understand what's good in our diet. We know, largely plant-based diets seem to be healthier than others, but why that is, we didn't really know, and we're beginning to understand that now, and it comes from the molecules that interact. So I would say there's going to be different stages. I think diagnostically and prognostically, that if you do that stool test in a child or even in a mother, just like a genetic test, you may be able to make conclusions about what's going to happen 10, 20 years down the line. This may happen in Parkinson's disease earlier than in others. And in terms of diet, I think that's probably not going to take as long. I think in the next 5 to maximum 10 years, we will understand, why certain diets are so much more beneficial through their effects on microbial metabolites and communication.
That's just amazing. That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to get my hands on your new book. And I'll definitely be sharing all of your information, making a link to your book. I love your website and all the videos and interviews you have. And I'll be linking to all of that on our site. And I know you're a very, very busy man, and I'm so grateful that you took this time to share your wisdom with our audience and really to bring clarity to this very complex and confusing world that oftentimes makes no sense to the families. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for this opportunity. I really enjoyed it. Anytime you want me to weigh in, it's particularly satisfying to me to be able to hopefully be of some assistance to to some of the parents that are struggling with these disorders and that often run against the medical system that has no clue and doesn't really recognize the importance and this holistic understanding. I think this is this is a big paradigm shift that we're undergoing in medicine, and it's driven to a big part by the microbiome science, because you can't understand that science in a linear reductionistic system. So I do hope that I'm going to be able to help and be of some value to your listeners. Thank you for having me on your show.
No, you already have just through this conversation. And, I never imagined myself, 10 years ago being where I am. And, for me, this is something that we really have to do. There's so many kids suffering. There's so many families who are suffering. Their families are falling apart because the kids are just going completely nuts, and it makes no sense. And, that's why I'm here. That's what this Holistic Minds is about. And I'm so grateful that you've taken the time. Thank you.
Anytime, Simon. Thank you very much again. Bye bye.
Have a beautiful day.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye bye.